Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In 1829, when the first whispers of gold began to echo through the hills of northern Georgia, few could have imagined that the precious metal would unearth secrets far more valuable and dangerous than any nugget pulled from the red clay earth. The discovery that would later be known as the Georgia Gold Rush brought fortune seekers from across the young nation. But it also exposed the darkest corners of human nature in ways that historians would spend decades trying to understand, and even longer trying to forget. The story begins not with the glint of gold, but with a photograph that should never have existed. In an era when daguerreotypes were rare and expensive, most enslaved people lived and died without their images ever being captured. Yet somewhere in the mountains of Habersham County, a single photograph survived, hidden away in the walls of a house that had stood empty for nearly a century when it was finally discovered in 1963. The image showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, seated beside a wooden table in what appeared to be a well-appointed parlor. Her dress was fine silk, not the rough homespun typically worn by those in bondage. Her hands were folded delicately in her lap, and her gaze met the camera with a directness that was both striking and unsettling. Most disturbing of all was the inscription on the back of the photograph, written in careful script. "My dearest Celeste, may this image preserve what words cannot express. W.H., 1829. The photograph came to light during the renovation of the old Whitmore estate, a crumbling plantation house that had been abandoned since the 1860s. Workers demolishing a chimney found a small wooden box hidden in a cavity between the bricks, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with wax. Inside were 3 items: the photograph, a lock of dark hair tied with blue ribbon, and a letter written in the same hand as the photograph's inscription. The letter, fragile with age and water damage, was barely legible, but what could be deciphered told of a relationship that violated every social convention of antebellum Georgia. The writer, who signed himself only as W., spoke of clandestine meetings in a cabin near Duke's Creek, of promises that could never be kept, and of a love that existed in the shadows of a society built upon the ownership of human beings. Local historian Margaret Thornton, who examined the documents in 1964, noted that the Whitmore family records showed no mention of an enslaved woman named Celeste. In fact, the plantation records were remarkably sparse for the 1820s, with entire years missing from the ledgers that typically documented every purchase, sale, and death among the enslaved population. What made the discovery even more intriguing was the quality of the photograph itself. The composition and lighting suggested the work of a skilled photographer. Yet there were no known daguerreotype studios operating in that remote part of Georgia in 1829. The nearest photographer of record was in Augusta, more than 100 miles away through treacherous mountain passes. The Whitmore estate had been home to William Harrison Whitmore, a third-generation planter who had inherited the property from his father in 1827. According to tax records, the plantation owned 43 enslaved people at its peak, making it one of the larger operations in Habersham County. William Whitmore was described in contemporary accounts as a reserved man who rarely participated in the social gatherings that were common among the planter class. What few knew at the time was that William Whitmore had spent 2 years in Philadelphia before returning to manage his inheritance. During those years, he had studied not agriculture or business, but chemistry and the emerging science of photography. His letters to suppliers in Charleston and Savannah, discovered decades later in courthouse records, included orders for silver plates, mercury, and other chemicals that had no apparent use in cotton cultivation. The gold rush of 1829 changed everything in northern Georgia. Prospectors flooded into the region, many of them rough men with little regard for property rights or social conventions. The Cherokee, who had called the mountains home for centuries, found their lands overrun by fortune-seekers who cared nothing for treaties or tribal sovereignty. In this atmosphere of lawlessness and greed, established planters like William Whitmore found their authority challenged and their property threatened. It was during this chaotic period that Celeste first appeared in the fragmentary records that survived. A bill of sale dated March 15th. 1829 showed that William Whitmore had purchased a 20-year-old woman named Celeste from a dealer in Augusta. The price, $400, was unusually high for the time, suggesting either exceptional skills or unusual circumstances surrounding the transaction. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantations described the Whitmore place as becoming increasingly isolated during the spring of 1829. Visitors were discouraged, and William Whitmore was rarely seen at the county courthouse or the Methodist church, where he had previously been a regular attendee. His overseer, a man named Thomas Garrett, complained to friends that his employer had become secretive and difficult to work with, often countermanding orders and making inexplicable changes to the plantation's routine. The transformation of the Whitmore plantation did not go unnoticed by the enslaved community. According to oral histories collected in the early 20th century, there were whispers among the quarters about the master's strange behavior and the new woman who lived not in the slave cabins, but in a small house near the main residence. Some said she was the daughter of a free woman of color. Others claimed she had been purchased to serve as a companion to William Whitmore's ailing mother, though no such woman lived on the plantation. As summer approached, tensions in the region continued to escalate. Gold prospectors were finding significant deposits along the streams that flowed down from the mountains, and conflicts between miners and landowners became increasingly violent. The federal government was under pressure to remove the Cherokee from their ancestral lands, and rumors circulated that the entire region would soon be reorganized to accommodate the mining boom. It was against this backdrop that the first disturbing reports began to emerge from the Whitmore plantation. Travelers on the road that passed near the estate spoke of hearing music at odd hours, particularly in the evening when plantation work should have ceased. The music was described as unlike anything typically heard in the quarters, with melodies that seemed foreign and instruments that could not be identified. More troubling were the reports of light seen moving through the woods between the main house and Duke's Creek. Night riders traveling the mountain roads reported seeing lanterns carried by figures who seemed to vanish when approached. Some claimed to have heard voices speaking in languages they could not understand, though this may have been Cherokee words carried on the wind from displaced native camps hidden in the deeper mountains. The enslaved workers on the plantation began to show signs of distress that went beyond the usual hardships of bondage. According to statements given years later to Freedmen's Bureau agents, several people attempted to run away during the summer of 1829, despite the increased patrols and harsh penalties that awaited captured runaways. Those who remained spoke of a feeling of unease that seemed to permeate the entire estate. Thomas Garrett, the overseer, left his position in early August without explanation. His replacement, a man named Samuel Pierce, lasted only 3 weeks before he too departed abruptly. Pierce was later found in a boarding house in Gainesville, refusing to speak about his experiences at the Whitmore plantation and displaying what witnesses described as signs of severe nervous exhaustion. The photograph that would eventually be discovered in the chimney was likely taken during this period of upheaval. The technical quality of the image suggests it was created by someone with considerable skill and access to proper equipment, yet the setting appears to be improvised, possibly in one of the outbuildings of the plantation rather than a proper studio. Local records from the period show that William Whitmore made several trips to Charleston during the late summer of 1829, ostensibly to arrange for the sale of his cotton crop. However, shipping records indicate that no cotton was actually transported from the Whitmore plantation that year, despite reports of a successful harvest. Instead, Whitmore appears to have used these trips to purchase supplies and equipment whose purpose remains unclear. The relationship between William Whitmore and Celeste, whatever its true nature, was conducted in complete secrecy. No contemporary accounts mention her by name, and she appears in no official records after the initial bill of sale. Yet the photograph and letter found in the chimney suggest a connection that went far beyond the typical arrangements between enslaved people and their owners. The letter, in its fragmentary state, contained phrases that historians would later find deeply troubling. References to promises made in sacred places and bonds that transcend earthly law suggested a relationship that may have involved elements that violated not only social conventions, but possibly civil and criminal law as well. The mention of "our sanctuary by the creek" implied a location where clandestine meetings took place, away from the scrutiny of the plantation community. As autumn arrived in 1829, the situation in northern Georgia became increasingly unstable. The discovery of gold had attracted thousands of prospectors, many of whom had no respect for property rights or established authority. Violence between miners and landowners escalated, and the state government began to consider more drastic measures to maintain order. The Cherokee removal, which would later be known as the Trail of Tears, was still several years in the future, but the groundwork was already being laid. White settlers and miners were pressuring the government to ignore existing treaties and open all Cherokee lands to exploitation. The mountains where the Whitmore plantation was located would eventually become some of the most productive gold mining territory in North America. Against this backdrop of violence and legal chaos, what happened at the Whitmore plantation in the final months of 1829 remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Georgia's antebellum history. The evidence suggests that William Whitmore and Celeste were living in an arrangement that defied every social convention of their time, but the exact nature of their relationship and what ultimately became of it can only be pieced together from fragments and rumors. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came in early October, when a neighboring planter named Robert Caldwell rode to the Whitmore estate to discuss the sale of some livestock. Caldwell later told authorities that he found the main house deserted, except for an elderly enslaved man who claimed that the master had gone on a journey and could not say when he might return. What disturbed Caldwell most was not the absence of William Whitmore, but the condition of the enslaved community. Several of the quarters stood empty, and those people who remained seemed fearful and reluctant to speak. When pressed for information about their owners' whereabouts, they gave contradictory accounts that suggested either confusion or deliberate deception. Caldwell reported his concerns to the sheriff of Habersham County, a man named Daniel Morrison, who had been struggling to maintain order in the face of the gold rush chaos. Morrison's investigation, such as it was, consisted of a single visit to the Whitmore plantation in late October. His report, filed with the county clerk, stated simply that William Whitmore had departed on business related to his holdings, and that his return was expected before the end of the year. No further official investigation was conducted, despite growing rumors and concerns among the neighboring planters. The explanation for this apparent negligence may lie in the fact that Sheriff Morrison was himself involved in several questionable mining ventures and had little time or inclination to pursue matters that did not directly affect his own interests. Meanwhile, the enslaved community at the Whitmore plantation was left in a state of limbo. Without an overseer and with their owner absent, they were forced to maintain the property and care for themselves with minimal supervision. Some took advantage of this freedom to escape to the north, while others remained, perhaps hoping that their situation might improve if they demonstrated loyalty and reliability. It was during this period of abandonment that several disturbing discoveries were made on the plantation grounds. Workers cleaning out one of the storage buildings found evidence of what appeared to be a makeshift photographic laboratory, including glass plates, chemical baths, and developing equipment. The sophistication of the setup suggested that someone had been conducting serious photographic work over an extended period. Even more puzzling was the discovery of personal items that seemed to belong to a woman of considerable means. These included silk dresses, jewelry, and books that would have been far beyond the reach of any enslaved person. The books, several of which were inscribed with the name Celeste, included works of poetry and philosophy that were considered inappropriate reading material for women, regardless of their race or social status. The winter of 1829 to 1830 was harsh, even by mountain standards. Snow fell early and often, and many of the prospectors who had flocked to the region during the warmer months found themselves stranded in inadequate shelters. Several died of exposure or disease, and others abandoned their claims to seek better conditions elsewhere. At the Whitmore plantation, the situation became increasingly desperate. With no owner present to arrange for supplies or payment, the enslaved community was forced to survive on what they could produce themselves. Several elderly people died during the worst of the winter weather, and others suffered from malnutrition and disease. It was not until the spring of 1830 that the true scope of the mystery began to emerge. A group of Cherokee families, displaced by the increasing pressure from white settlers, had taken shelter in the woods near Duke's Creek during the winter months. When they emerged in early March, they brought with them stories that would haunt the region for decades. According to the Cherokee accounts, which were recorded years later by sympathetic missionaries, strange lights and sounds had been observed in the area throughout the winter. Most disturbing were reports of smoke rising from what appeared to be a cabin or structure near the creek. Despite the fact that no such building was known to exist in that location, when Cherokee hunters investigated, they found the remains of a small log structure that had been burned to the ground. Among the ashes were fragments of photographic equipment, pieces of women's clothing, and what appeared to be human bones. The Cherokee, recognizing the potential for being blamed for whatever had occurred, carefully reburied the remains and said nothing about their discovery to white authorities. The spring thaw also brought renewed attention to the Whitmore plantation. Creditors and tax collectors began making inquiries about William Whitmore's whereabouts, and questions were raised about the legal status of the property and its inhabitants. A court-appointed administrator was eventually named to oversee the estate, though his authority was limited and his investigations were superficial. The administrator, a lawyer named Charles Hamilton, conducted a thorough inventory of the plantation's assets, but found several puzzling discrepancies. The enslaved population had decreased significantly from what the records indicated it should have been, and there was no accounting for several people who had been present as recently as the previous summer. Most mysterious was the complete absence of any trace of the woman known as Celeste. According to the original bill of sale, she should have been present on the plantation, yet no one could provide any information about her whereabouts. When questioned, the remaining enslaved people claimed to have no memory of such a person, though their responses suggested fear rather than genuine ignorance. The photographic equipment found in the storage building posed another puzzle. Hamilton had no expertise in such matters, but he recognized that the apparatus was far more sophisticated than anything that should have been present on a rural Georgia plantation. When he attempted to have it appraised, he discovered that similar equipment was being used by only a handful of practitioners in major cities like Charleston, Savannah, and Augusta. As summer approached, Hamilton's investigation became increasingly frustrated by the lack of cooperation from local authorities and the apparent conspiracy of silence that surrounded the Whitmore plantation. His reports to the court expressed growing concern about what he termed irregularities of the most serious nature, but provided little in the way of specific evidence. The situation was complicated by the ongoing gold rush, which had transformed the entire region beyond recognition. Prospectors had established several mining camps within a few miles of the Whitmore estate, and their presence made any serious investigation difficult. Many of the miners were rough men, with questionable pasts, and they had little respect for legal authority or property rights. It was against this backdrop that Hamilton made what he later described as the most disturbing discovery of his entire legal career. While examining the main house of the plantation in preparation for its potential sale, he found evidence of what appeared to be a hidden room or chamber beneath the kitchen. The entrance was concealed behind a heavy cabinet that required 3 men to move. The chamber itself was small, perhaps 8 feet square, and had obviously been constructed with great care and secrecy. The walls were lined with wooden shelves that contained numerous glass photographic plates, each one carefully wrapped and labeled. When held up to the light, the plates revealed images that Hamilton later described as of such a nature as to defy both description and comprehension. Hamilton's report to the court was sealed and remained classified for more than a century. When it was finally opened in 1967, researchers found that entire sections had been redacted or removed altogether. What remained suggested that the photographs depicted subjects and activities that violated both civil law and social conventions in ways that the court found too disturbing to document fully. The discovery of the hidden chamber marked the end of Hamilton's investigation. Within days of filing his report, he requested to be relieved of his duties as administrator of the Whitmore estate. His replacement, a lawyer from Augusta named William Bradford, conducted only the most cursory examination of the property before recommending that it be sold at public auction. The auction, held in September of 1830, attracted little interest. The isolation of the property, combined with rumors about its troubled history, kept serious buyers away. The plantation was eventually purchased by a mining consortium for a fraction of its assessed value, and the new owners immediately began excavating the grounds in search of gold deposits. The enslaved people who had remained on the plantation were sold separately, and most were dispersed to other counties or states. A few elderly individuals were freed, either because of their age or because no buyer could be found for them. These people carried with them stories and memories that would be passed down through generations, though many details were lost or deliberately obscured over time. The mining operations on the former Whitmore plantation continued sporadically for several decades, but the gold deposits proved less extensive than had been hoped. By the 1860s, most of the original structures had been dismantled or had fallen into ruin. The main house stood empty until after the Civil War, when it was finally demolished by scavengers seeking building materials. It was not until the 1920s that serious archaeological interest was shown in the site. A graduate student from the University of Georgia, working on a thesis about antebellum plantation life, obtained permission to conduct excavations on the property. Her work uncovered fragments of photographic equipment, pieces of clothing, and other artifacts that suggested the site had been occupied continuously until at least the 1830s. Most intriguingly, the excavations revealed evidence of the cabin or structure near Duke's Creek that the Cherokee had reported finding burned. The foundation stones were still visible beneath decades of accumulated soil and vegetation, and careful excavation revealed fragments of glass and metal that confirmed the presence of photographic equipment at the site. The graduate student, Margaret Thornton, also discovered what appeared to be a small cemetery or burial ground in the woods near the creek. The graves were unmarked and arranged in no particular pattern, suggesting hurried or clandestine interments. When she attempted to obtain permission to exhume the remains for study, she was denied by local authorities who cited concerns about disturbing what might be Cherokee burial sites. Thornton's research was cut short in 1928 when she suffered what was described as a nervous breakdown. Her notes and findings were donated to the university library, where they remained largely ignored until the 1960s. When other researchers attempted to continue her work, they found that many of the artifacts she had collected had mysteriously disappeared from the university's storage facilities. The photograph of Celeste was not the only image discovered in the hidden chamber of the Whitmore house. According to Hamilton's sealed report, there were dozens of photographic plates depicting various subjects, though the exact nature of these images remained classified. What is known is that several of the plates showed the same young woman in different settings and poses, suggesting that she had been photographed multiple times over an extended period. The technical quality of the photographs was remarkable for the time period. The clarity and composition suggested the work of someone with considerable skill and experience. Yet there was no record of any professional photographer operating in that part of Georgia during the 1820s or 30s. The conclusion reached by later experts was that William Whitmore had somehow acquired both the equipment and the expertise necessary to produce photographs of professional quality. The relationship between Whitmore and Celeste, as revealed through the fragmentary evidence that survived, appeared to violate every social and legal convention of antebellum Georgia. The photograph found in the chimney showed a level of intimacy and equality that was simply impossible between a white planter and an enslaved woman in the society of that time. Yet the evidence clearly suggested that such a relationship had existed, at least for a period of months during 1829. What made the situation even more extraordinary was the apparent sophistication and education of the woman herself. The books found among her possessions suggested someone with considerable learning, and the quality of her clothing indicated access to resources that would have been far beyond the reach of any enslaved person. The inscription on the photograph, referring to her as Dearest Celeste, implied a level of affection and respect that was unprecedented in the documented relationships between enslaved people and their owners. The mystery deepened when researchers in the 1960s attempted to trace the origins of the woman known as Celeste. The bill of sale indicated that she had been purchased from a dealer in Augusta, but no corresponding records could be found in that city's archives. Moreover, the description of her in the bill of sale was remarkably vague, providing no information about her background, skills, or previous ownership. One theory that emerged was that Celeste was not actually an enslaved person at all, but rather a free woman of color who had been living on the plantation under false pretenses. Such arrangements, while illegal, were not unheard of in the antebellum South, particularly in remote areas where social oversight was minimal. However, this theory failed to explain how such a deception could have been maintained or why it would have been necessary. Another possibility was that Celeste was the daughter of a white father and an enslaved mother, making her legally enslaved despite her apparent education and sophistication. Such individuals often occupied ambiguous positions in Southern society, and some were able to live lives that approximated freedom while remaining technically the property of others. The quality of her clothing and possessions might be explained by the generosity of a father who, while unable to acknowledge her publicly, provided for her welfare privately. The most disturbing theory, and the one that seemed to be supported by the sealed court documents, was that Celeste was the victim of some form of elaborate deception or coercion. The hidden chamber, the secretive nature of the photographic sessions, and the ultimate disappearance of everyone involved suggested something far darker than a simple romantic relationship between consenting adults. The gold rush context cannot be ignored when considering the events at the Whitmore plantation. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia had created an atmosphere of lawlessness and greed that affected every aspect of life in the region. Traditional social structures were breaking down, and individuals who might normally have been constrained by community oversight found themselves free to pursue their desires without fear of discovery or punishment. William Whitmore's background and education may have contributed to his ability to manipulate both his enslaved workers and the broader community. His time in Philadelphia had exposed him to ideas and technologies that were unknown in rural Georgia, and his inheritance had given him the resources to pursue projects that would have been impossible for most of his contemporaries. The photographic equipment found on the plantation represented a significant investment in both money and effort. Daguerreotype photography in the 1820s required not only expensive equipment, but also considerable skill and knowledge of chemistry and optics. The fact that Whitmore had acquired this expertise and equipment suggests a level of premeditation and planning that was deeply troubling to contemporary authorities. As 1830 progressed, and no trace of William Whitmore or Celeste could be found, speculation about their fate grew increasingly wild. Some believed that they had fled together to the north or to Europe, where their relationship might be more acceptable. Others suggested that they had been murdered by prospectors seeking to claim the plantation's gold deposits. The most persistent theory, and the one that seemed to be supported by the Cherokee accounts of burned structures near Duke's Creek, was that both had died in the fire that destroyed their secret meeting place. This would explain the complete absence of any trace of them and the discovery of human remains among the ashes. However, the Cherokee insistence on reburying what they found meant that no scientific examination of the remains was ever possible. The dispersal of the enslaved community following the auction meant that potential witnesses to the events at the plantation were scattered across multiple states. Efforts to locate and interview these individuals in later years proved largely unsuccessful, as many had deliberately concealed their connection to the Whitmore plantation out of fear or shame. Those few interviews that were conducted revealed a consistent pattern of fear and reluctance to discuss the events of 1829. Several former enslaved people spoke of strange noises and lights emanating from the area near Duke's Creek, and all mentioned the abrupt changes in routine and atmosphere that occurred after Celeste's arrival on the plantation. One particularly disturbing account, recorded by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in 1867, described seeing William Whitmore and an unidentified woman walking together through the woods at night, carrying what appeared to be photographic equipment. The witness, an elderly man who had worked as a house servant, claimed that these nocturnal expeditions occurred regularly throughout the summer of 1829, and that they were always followed by strict orders for all enslaved people to remain in their quarters until dawn. The same witness also reported that Celeste lived not in the slave quarters, but in a small cabin that had been specially constructed for her near the main house. This cabin was described as being unusually well appointed, with glass windows, a proper floor, and furnishings that would have been appropriate for a white woman of some social standing. After Whitmore's disappearance, the cabin had been dismantled and burned, though no explanation was ever given for this action. By the time of the Civil War, the former Whitmore plantation had been largely forgotten, except by local residents who remembered the strange events of the 1820s and 30s. The property changed hands several times during the war years, and much of the land was eventually incorporated into the Chattahoochee National Forest. The photograph of Celeste and the letter that were discovered in the chimney in 1963 represented the first concrete evidence of the events that had taken place more than a century earlier. The decision by renovation workers to turn these items over to local historians rather than keeping them as curiosities was fortunate, as it allowed for proper preservation and study. Margaret Thornton, the historian who first examined the photograph and letter, spent several years attempting to piece together the story of William Whitmore and Celeste. Her research included interviews with elderly residents of the area, examination of courthouse records, and consultation with experts in antebellum photography and plantation life. Thornton's conclusion, published in a limited edition monograph in 1968, was that the relationship between Whitmore and Celeste represented one of the most complex and disturbing cases of exploitation and manipulation in the documented history of American slavery. While she acknowledged that the exact nature of their relationship could never be fully understood, she argued that the power imbalance inherent in slavery made any appearance of consent or mutual affection fundamentally questionable. The monograph also raised troubling questions about the role of photography in documenting and potentially perpetuating exploitation. The images found in the hidden chamber, while never publicly displayed, apparently included poses and compositions that suggested a level of objectification that went beyond mere portraiture. Thornton argued that the photographic sessions represented a form of psychological control that was as devastating as any physical abuse. The fate of the other photographic plates discovered in the hidden chamber remains a source of controversy and speculation. According to Thornton's research, the plates were removed from the plantation by court order and placed in the custody of state authorities. However, no official record of their disposition has ever been found, and it is assumed that they were destroyed to prevent their contents from becoming public knowledge. The ongoing mystery of what happened to William Whitmore and Celeste has inspired numerous theories and investigations over the years. Some researchers have suggested that they escaped together and established new identities in California or Oregon, taking advantage of the social upheaval of the gold rush era to disappear from their former lives. Others have argued that the evidence points to a more sinister conclusion, with one or both becoming victims of violence associated with the breakdown of law and order in Gold Rush, Georgia. The isolated location of the plantation and the presence of numerous desperate prospectors in the area would have made such crimes both possible and difficult to investigate. The most persistent theory, supported by the Cherokee accounts of the burned cabin and human remains, is that both died in 1829, possibly as the result of an accident or as victims of violence. The secretive nature of their relationship and the illegal activities suggested by the photographic evidence would have provided motives for murder, either by outraged community members or by individuals seeking to exploit the situation for their own benefit. What cannot be disputed is that the events at the Whitmore plantation represented a fundamental violation of the social order that governed antebellum Georgia. The relationship between a white plantation owner and an enslaved woman, regardless of its exact nature, challenged the racial and class hierarchies that underpinned Southern society. The photographic documentation of this relationship made it even more dangerous, as images could serve as permanent evidence of activities that typically remained hidden and unacknowledged. The discovery of the photograph and letter in 1963 came at a time when American society was grappling with its own racial dynamics during the civil rights era. The image of an enslaved woman treated with apparent dignity and respect provided a stark contrast to the stereotypical representations of slavery that had dominated popular culture for generations. Yet the circumstances surrounding the photograph also highlighted the fundamental impossibility of true consent or equality within the context of human bondage. Scholarly interest in the Whitmore plantation case has continued into the 21st century, with researchers using new technologies and methodologies to examine the available evidence. DNA analysis of hair samples found with the photograph has provided some insights into Celeste's ancestry, though definitive identification remains impossible without comparative samples. Advanced photographic analysis has confirmed that the image of Celeste was indeed created using daguerreotype technology of the 1820s, supporting the authenticity of the find. Computer enhancement has also revealed details in the photograph that were not visible to earlier researchers, including what appears to be a wedding ring on Celeste's left hand, a detail that adds another layer of complexity to the mystery. The psychological dimensions of the case have also attracted attention from researchers interested in the dynamics of power and control in slavery. The apparent sophistication of Celeste, as evidenced by her possessions and the quality of her photograph, raises questions about how such individuals navigated the impossible contradictions of their situations. Some scholars have argued that the case represents an example of what they term intimate slavery, relationships that blurred the lines between exploitation and affection, while never truly escaping the fundamental inequality imposed by bondage. Others have emphasized the violence inherent in all such relationships, arguing that the apparent luxury and care provided to Celeste served only to mask and perpetuate her victimization. The broader historical context of the Georgia Gold Rush also provides important insights into the case. The discovery of gold created opportunities for individuals to reinvent themselves and escape the constraints of traditional society, but it also unleashed forces of greed and violence that destroyed existing communities and relationships. William Whitmore's ability to conduct his relationship with Celeste in relative secrecy was made possible by the chaos and social upheaval of the Gold Rush era. At the same time, the same forces that enabled their relationship may have ultimately destroyed it, as the breakdown of law and order created an environment where exploitation and violence could flourish unchecked. The environmental setting of the case in the mountains of northern Georgia also played a crucial role. The isolation of the Whitmore plantation provided the privacy necessary for clandestine activities, while the rugged terrain made investigation and oversight difficult. The nearby Cherokee lands offered potential refuge for those seeking to escape scrutiny, but also created additional tensions and conflicts that complicated the situation. The role of photography in documenting and perhaps perpetuating the relationship between Whitmore and Celeste represents one of the earliest examples of the technology being used to record intimate relationships that violated social norms. The care and effort that went into creating and preserving the images suggests that they served purposes beyond mere documentation, possibly functioning as tools of manipulation or control. The hidden chamber where the photographs were stored also indicates a level of premeditation and secrecy that goes beyond casual documentation. The construction of such a space required significant effort and planning, suggesting that Whitmore anticipated the need to conceal evidence of his activities from potential investigators. The ultimate fate of the relationship and its participants remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. The complete disappearance of both William Whitmore and Celeste along with the destruction of their meeting place near Duke's Creek, suggests a dramatic and possibly violent conclusion to their story. Contemporary accounts of the Cherokee discovery of burned remains near the creek provide the most credible evidence for what may have happened, though the decision to rebury the remains without official examination means that definitive proof will never be available. The Cherokee motivation for this action, rooted in their own precarious legal situation and fear of being blamed for white deaths, is understandable but ultimately frustrating for later researchers. The broader implications of the case extend beyond the immediate mystery of what happened to Whitmore and Celeste. The story illustrates the complex and often contradictory nature of human relationships under the system of slavery, where genuine affection and brutal exploitation could coexist in ways that defied simple moral categorization. The case also highlights the role of technology, in this instance photography, in both documenting and potentially enabling exploitation. The images found in the hidden chamber serve as a permanent record of activities that would otherwise have left no trace, but they also raise troubling questions about consent, dignity, and the purposes for which they were created. The social and legal systems of antebellum Georgia proved incapable of addressing the complexities raised by the Whitmore case. The racial hierarchies and gender conventions of the time made it impossible to acknowledge or investigate the relationship between Whitmore and Celeste as anything other than a violation of natural and social order. As the 19th century progressed and the Civil War transformed Southern society, the memory of the Whitmore plantation gradually faded from public consciousness. The social upheavals of Reconstruction and the New South movement created new priorities and concerns that overshadowed the mysteries of the Gold Rush era. It was not until the civil rights movement of the 20th century brought renewed attention to the history of slavery and racial oppression that cases like that of the Whitmore plantation began to receive serious scholarly attention. The discovery of the photograph and letter in 1963 provided a tangible connection to a past that had been largely forgotten or deliberately obscured. The ongoing fascination with the case reflects broader questions about how societies remember and interpret their difficult histories. The story of William Whitmore and Celeste challenges simple narratives about slavery and resistance, presenting a complex web of relationships and motivations that resist easy categorization. The physical evidence that survives from the case, including the photograph, letter, and various artifacts discovered during archaeological investigations, continues to attract researchers hoping to solve the mystery of what really happened during those turbulent months of 1829. Each new examination brings additional insights, but also raises new questions about the nature of the relationship and its ultimate resolution. The Cherokee accounts of the burned cabin and human remains provide perhaps the most credible explanation for the disappearance of Whitmore and Celeste, but the lack of official investigation or documentation means that this conclusion remains speculative. The cultural and legal barriers that prevented proper examination of the evidence at the time continue to frustrate modern researchers seeking definitive answers. The environmental and archaeological evidence from the Duke's Creek site supports the Cherokee accounts to some degree, with clear indications that a structure existed in that location and was destroyed by fire. However, the passage of more than a century and the subsequent development of the area have made detailed investigation impossible. The photograph of Celeste remains the most powerful and enigmatic piece of evidence in the case. Her direct gaze and dignified bearing seem to challenge the viewer across more than a century, demanding recognition of her humanity in a society that refused to acknowledge it. The technical quality of the image, combined with the careful composition and lighting, suggests that considerable time and effort were invested in creating what may have been intended as a permanent record of a relationship that could never be publicly acknowledged. The inscription on the back of the photograph, written in William Whitmore's careful script, provides additional clues about the nature of their connection. The phrase, "May this image preserve what words cannot express," suggests emotions and commitments that went far beyond the typical interactions between enslaved people and their owners. The formal tone and romantic language indicate a level of sentiment that would have been considered scandalous and dangerous in the social context of 1829 Georgia. Modern analysis of the photograph has revealed details that were not apparent to earlier researchers. Advanced digital enhancement has shown that Celeste wore what appears to be a wedding ring, though whether this represented an actual ceremony or merely symbolic jewelry cannot be determined. The ring's presence adds another layer of complexity to an already puzzling case, as legal marriage between white men and enslaved women was impossible under Georgia law. The clothing visible in the photograph has been analyzed by experts in period fashion, who confirm that the dress and accessories were of the finest quality available at the time. The silk fabric, intricate lacework, and careful tailoring suggest garments that would have cost more than many working men earned in a year. The source of such expensive clothing raises questions about how Celeste came to possess it and what her relationship with Whitmore actually entailed. The broader investigation into the Whitmore plantation case has revealed patterns that extend beyond the immediate mystery of what happened to William and Celeste. Records from other plantations in the region show evidence of similar irregularities during the gold rush period, suggesting that the social upheaval created opportunities for various forms of exploitation and manipulation that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Several other plantation owners in northern Georgia were reported to have abandoned their properties abruptly during 1829 and 1830. Though none left behind evidence as dramatic as that found at the Whitmore estate. The gold rush appears to have disrupted traditional plantation agriculture to a degree that historians are only beginning to understand, with some operations ceasing entirely, while others adapted to serve the needs of the mining camps. The Cherokee perspective on these events, preserved in oral traditions and later missionary accounts, provides additional context for understanding what occurred. According to these sources, the period of the gold rush was seen as a time of great spiritual and social danger, when traditional boundaries between the human and spirit worlds became dangerously thin. The Cherokee accounts of strange lights and sounds in the mountains may reflect genuine supernatural beliefs, but they also document the very real atmosphere of violence and unpredictability that characterized the region during this period. The forced removal of the Cherokee from their ancestral lands, which accelerated after the discovery of gold, eliminated one of the few groups that might have provided independent witness accounts of what occurred at isolated plantations like Whitmore's. The Trail of Tears, which began in earnest in 1838, scattered the Cherokee across the continent and disrupted the oral traditions that preserved their memories of the gold rush era. Contemporary newspaper accounts from Augusta, Milledgeville, and other Georgia cities provide glimpses of how the mysterious disappearances and strange events in the mountain counties were perceived by urban readers. Most reports treated such stories as evidence of the lawless and uncivilized nature of frontier life, with little recognition of the complex social and economic forces at work. The Atlanta Constitution, in an 1831 editorial, described the northern counties as a realm where civilized authority holds no sway and where the basest impulses of human nature find ready expression. While such language reflected the prejudices of urban elites against rural populations, it also acknowledged the genuine breakdown of social order that characterized the gold rush period. Religious leaders of the time struggled to address the moral implications of what was occurring in the mining regions. Methodist and Baptist ministers reported difficulty maintaining congregations and enforcing church discipline in areas where traditional community structures had collapsed. Several ministerial accounts from the period mention abominations and violations of divine law occurring on isolated plantations, though specific details were rarely provided. The economic disruption caused by the gold rush extended far beyond the immediate mining areas. Traditional plantation agriculture became difficult to maintain when enslaved workers could potentially escape to mining camps where their labor was in demand, and questions about their legal status might not be asked. Some plantation owners responded by moving their operations to more secure locations, while others attempted to adapt by contracting their workers to mining operations. William Whitmore's decision to pursue photography rather than gold mining distinguished him from most of his contemporaries, but may have reflected a more sophisticated understanding of the economic opportunities created by social upheaval. The photographic equipment found on his plantation represented a significant investment that could only have been justified by substantial anticipated returns. Whether financial or personal, the technical aspects of daguerreotype photography in the 1820s required not only expensive equipment but also access to specialized chemicals and materials that were difficult to obtain in rural areas. Whitmore's ability to maintain a photographic operation on his isolated plantation suggests either extensive advance planning or connections to suppliers that have left no documentary trace. The hidden chamber where the photographs were stored was constructed with remarkable sophistication, featuring climate control measures and security provisions that indicate considerable expertise in both engineering and chemistry. The design suggests that Whitmore intended the space to preserve its contents for extended periods, possibly anticipating that the photographs might serve as evidence or documentation for future use. The psychological dimensions of the relationship between Whitmore and Celeste continue to attract scholarly attention, particularly from researchers interested in the dynamics of power and control under slavery. The apparent care taken in photographing Celeste and preserving her image suggests emotional investment that went beyond mere sexual exploitation, yet the fundamental inequality of their positions makes any assessment of genuine consent impossible. Some historians have argued that the case represents an early example of what would later be termed intimate terrorism, a pattern of psychological control that uses apparent affection and special treatment to mask and perpetuate abuse. The luxury items found among Celeste's possessions, rather than indicating genuine care, may have served as tools of manipulation designed to create emotional dependency and discourage resistance. The isolation of the Whitmore plantation created conditions that enabled both the relationship itself and its documentation through photography. The nearest neighbors were several miles away, and the disruption caused by gold prospecting meant that normal patterns of social interaction and oversight were suspended. This privacy came at the cost of leaving Celeste with no realistic means of escape or appeal for assistance. The fate of the other enslaved people on the Whitmore plantation remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Contemporary records suggest that several individuals simply vanished during the period when Whitmore was conducting his photographic experiments, with no accounting for their whereabouts or ultimate disposition. Whether they escaped, were sold secretly, or met more sinister fates remains unknown. The administrative records from the court-appointed overseer indicate that standard plantation operations ceased almost entirely during the summer and fall of 1829. Cotton that should have been harvested was left to rot in the fields, and livestock were allowed to roam freely without proper care. This abandonment of normal agricultural routines suggests that Whitmore's attention was completely focused on other pursuits. The Cherokee accounts of the burned structure near Duke's Creek become more significant when considered alongside the evidence of abandoned plantation operations. If the cabin served as a location for photographic sessions and clandestine meetings, its destruction may have been intended to eliminate evidence of activities that had become increasingly dangerous as community suspicions grew. The timing of the disappearances, coinciding with the approach of winter in 1829, suggests either flight to a warmer climate or a tragedy that prevented any possibility of escape. The harsh mountain winters would have made travel difficult for anyone lacking proper preparation and resources, particularly if they were attempting to avoid detection by traveling through wilderness areas. Federal investigators who examined the case decades later noted patterns of behavior that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action. The gradual isolation of the plantation, the construction of the photographic facility, and the apparent grooming of Celeste all indicated a systematic approach that may have been months or years in development. The psychological profile that emerges from the available evidence suggests an individual capable of elaborate deception and manipulation. Whitmore's public persona as a respectable plantation owner concealed activities that violated every social and legal norm of his time, yet he maintained this facade successfully until his final disappearance. The role of the gold rush in enabling and concealing these activities cannot be overstated. The social chaos and breakdown of traditional authority created opportunities for exploitation that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. At the same time, the same forces that enabled Whitmore's activities may have ultimately destroyed him when they spiraled beyond his control. Local folklore that developed in the years following the disappearances includes numerous stories about lights and sounds in the mountains near the former Whitmore plantation. While such accounts may reflect genuine supernatural beliefs, they also document the lasting impact of these events on the collective memory of the community. The discovery of the photograph and letter in 1963 marked the beginning of renewed interest in the case, but it also raised new questions about how such evidence should be interpreted and preserved. The decision to make the photograph available for scholarly study, while keeping the more disturbing images from the hidden chamber sealed, reflects ongoing debates about the ethics of historical research and public education. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to the available evidence with mixed results. DNA analysis of hair samples has provided some information about Celeste's ancestry, but the lack of comparative samples makes definitive identification impossible. Chemical analysis of the photographic materials has confirmed their authenticity and provided insights into the techniques used in their creation. The psychological impact of the case on subsequent researchers has been noted by several historians who have attempted to investigate the events at the Whitmore plantation. Margaret Thornton's nervous breakdown in 1928 was only the first of several instances where scholars have reported difficulty coping with the emotional weight of the evidence they uncovered. The moral complexity of the case continues to challenge contemporary understanding of slavery and its legacies. The apparent sophistication and agency displayed by Celeste in the photograph seems to contradict stereotypical images of enslaved people as passive victims, yet the fundamental coercion inherent in her situation makes any appearance of choice or consent deeply problematic. The broader historical significance of the case extends beyond its immediate mystery to illuminate the complex ways in which power, race, and gender intersected in antebellum America. The relationship between Whitmore and Celeste existed in a space between the accepted categories of master and slave, white and black, human and property, creating contradictions that neither contemporary society nor modern scholarship has been able to fully resolve. The environmental legacy of the gold rush in northern Georgia provides additional context for understanding why the Whitmore case has proven so difficult to investigate thoroughly. The mining operations that followed the discovery of gold dramatically altered the landscape, destroying evidence and making archaeological investigation challenging. The transformation of the region from agricultural to industrial use, followed by its eventual reforestation and incorporation into the national forest system, has created layers of historical change that obscure the traces of earlier events. The site of the former Whitmore plantation is now accessible only through hiking trails that provide no indication of its troubled past. The Cherokee removal and the dispersal of the enslaved community eliminated most potential witnesses to the events of 1829 and 1830. The few accounts that were recorded decades later often contained contradictory details that may reflect the natural distortion of memory over time or deliberate obfuscation by individuals who feared the consequences of speaking truthfully about what they had witnessed. The legal and ethical questions raised by the case continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about historical research and interpretation. The sealed court documents and hidden photographs represent evidence that could potentially solve the mystery, but their restricted status reflects ongoing concerns about privacy, dignity, and the potential for sensationalism. The photograph of Celeste has become an icon for historians studying the complexities of slavery and resistance, yet its power as a historical document is inseparable from the troubling circumstances of its creation. The image simultaneously humanizes and objectifies its subject, creating a visual paradox that mirrors the contradictions inherent in the relationship it documents. As the 21st century progresses and new technologies become available for historical investigation, the possibility remains that additional evidence about the Whitmore case may emerge. Ground-penetrating radar and other archaeological techniques could potentially locate burial sites or structural remains that have been hidden for nearly 2 centuries. However, the passage of time has also made resolution of the central mystery increasingly unlikely. The people who might have provided direct testimony are long dead, and the physical evidence has been scattered, destroyed, or lost to natural processes. What remains is a collection of fragments that suggest a story of profound human complexity but resist definitive interpretation. The Cherokee accounts of finding human remains among the ashes of the burned cabin near Duke's Creek provide the most plausible explanation for what became of William Whitmore and Celeste. Whether their deaths resulted from accident, suicide, or murder will never be known with certainty, but the complete absence of any trace of them after winter 1829 to 1830 suggests a dramatic and final conclusion to their story. The decision by the Cherokee to rebury the remains they found, while understandable given their precarious legal situation, represents one of the greatest losses for historical understanding of the case. Modern forensic techniques could potentially have provided definitive identification and cause of death information that might have solved the mystery entirely. The broader legacy of the case extends beyond its immediate historical significance to questions about how difficult and controversial aspects of the past should be remembered and interpreted. The story of William Whitmore and Celeste defies simple moral categorization, presenting a narrative that is simultaneously a love story and an exploitation account, a tale of resistance and a document of oppression. The photograph that started this investigation continues to challenge viewers more than 150 years after it was created. Celeste's direct gaze seems to demand recognition of her humanity and dignity, yet the circumstances that brought the image into existence remind us of the fundamental violence and inequality that characterized the society in which she lived. In the end, the mystery of what happened during those fateful months of 1829 in the mountains of northern Georgia may be less important than what the case reveals about the complex and often contradictory nature of human relationships under systems of oppression. The story serves as a reminder that historical truth is often more nuanced and troubling than the simplified narratives that societies construct to make sense of their past. The documents and artifacts that survive from the Whitmore plantation continue to be studied by researchers seeking to understand not only what happened to William and Celeste, but what their story reveals about the broader experience of slavery, resistance, and survival in antebellum America. Each new examination brings additional insights while confirming that some aspects of the past will forever remain beyond our complete understanding. The photograph of Celeste, with its haunting beauty and troubling implications, stands as a testament to the complexity of human experience under even the most dehumanizing circumstances. Her image preserves not only her individual story, but serves as a window into a world where love and exploitation, dignity and degradation, resistance and submission existed in impossible tension. And perhaps, in the silence that surrounds the final fate of those who lived and died at the forgotten plantation in the Georgia mountains, we find the truest testimony to the human cost of a system that sought to reduce people to property, yet could never entirely succeed in destroying the bonds of affection, hope, and determination that make us fundamentally human.